We're recording and I'm gonna hit broadcast.
Welcome. We're just going to wait a few more seconds for people to trickle into the Zoom meeting, and then we'll begin. Okay, so for everybody in the Capital Region and around the country and around the world who is with us today, we would like to welcome you to part 2 of Understanding White Supremacy with Barbara Smith. So my name is Sienna Thiem and I am with XRCR, Extinction Rebellion of the Capital Region, and I'm just going to go over a couple of things with you before we get started. First of all, there will be a Zoom meeting following this meeting for people to have the opportunity to mingle with one another and have open conversation about everything that we are about to learn. And we knew that there was a decent amount of feedback that people wanted to be able to have that like face-to-face interaction with one another. So they will be posting the link to the preceding Zoom meeting in your chat feature. Also, just a few notes about the Q&A that will be happening at the end of the webinar. During part 1, we had the text-based Q&A feature open, and this time we're going to be formatting it a little bit differently for those of you who are with us for part 1. At the end of the meeting, we will be activating the raise hand feature, which you can either find at the bottom of your screen, or for me, I'm on my smartphone. It's under the ellipsis, the more. And so when we open it up for Q&A, we will be activating that feature. And if you have a question that you would like to ask Barbara, you can press the raise hand button. And one of our people behind the scenes will be keeping a list of all of the people with their hands raised and selecting people from the list. And if you are selected, then you will be temporarily given video access to ask your question directly to Barbara. And we would also like to remind you, if you have not already, and if you are able to do so, we really ask that you give a donation to the Barbara Smith Caring Circle, and that link will also be available in the chat, in the chat feature. So I think, looking at my list, that is all of the little fun details that I have to go over with you all. And so I am going to hand it over to Dorothy Tristman, who is a fellow activist with Extinction Rebellion of the Capital Region and the Solidarity Committee. And she is a teacher in peer counseling and a personal friend of mine. So Dorothy.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sienna, and welcome to everyone. I wish I could see everyone's faces right now, because it's such a wonderful thing that we're together to be thinking about this key issue of white supremacy. And the reason that XRCR has invited Barbara to talk to us about that is because we see that the question of the climate crisis is inseparable from the roots of white supremacy, that we need to look at both at the same time. And with that in mind, Barbara Smith is the perfect person to be thinking about this with us, because she was a pioneer in introducing the intellectual tool of intersectionality in her co-authored essay in the Combahee River Collective Statement, which came out in 1977, and it's still very relevant today and helping us think about that intersectional relationship between climate justice and white supremacy. And as you probably know, Barbara is a Black feminist scholar, writer, activist, former elected official, educator, just a person of great integrity and commitment and depth. And we're really lucky that she's here. Hopefully you had a chance to read the articles that were in your registration form that were recommended. And in addition, I just wanted to mention 3 books that are in your chat, 3 of Barbara's books. There's many more that you can, and articles that you can reference, but we're underlining the ones that Barbara asked us to recommend. All the women are white, all the Blacks are men, but some of us are brave. And then there's Homegirls, a Black feminist anthology. And also the third, Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around, 40 Years of Movement Building with Barbara Smith. So highly recommended reading. And again, so much appreciation for your time, Barbara, and for your thinking. Yeah, I'm excited to introduce you. I'm so happy to be with you on this journey. So Barbara Smith, take it away.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone who I can't see. One of the things that I wanted to do with this is our second session of Understanding White Supremacy with Extinction Rebellion in the Capital Region of New York. One of the things I wanted to do is I just felt frustrated by the fact that there was no interaction, or at least minimal interaction with only written questions. And so we're going to, as Sienna said, do it differently today. And then I'll get to, I hope, see a few of you as we get into the Q&A part of our presentation. And the Q&A part will come at the end of what I am offering and sharing with you today. I wanted to start the same way that I did 2 weeks ago, and that's with this a little introduction of why we're talking about white supremacy. Why is it important to talk about white supremacy instead of prejudice, implicit bias, discrimination, microaggressions, inequality, etc., etc.? Because none of these terms are causal. These are all symptoms or results of white supremacy. They do not refer to the cause of North America's ongoing race war. Systemic racism is an accurate description, but it does not necessarily point to a nexus of power. And white supremacy is a nexus of power. It is enforced and very rigid and pervasive, and has been with us from the minute that the people from Europe first made contact with the people whose land this is. So that's 500 years plus. So I'm going to start with a question. And that question is, how do you think white supremacy has been doing since we met 2 weeks ago? How's it getting along? Is it doing okay? I want you to think about the last 2 weeks and all the things that have happened that indicate that the system of white supremacy is as alive and well as ever. And I'm going to pause so that you can give that some thought. And the question is, how do you think white supremacy has been doing since we met 2 weeks ago? I was planning to start with talking about what happened a week ago in Kenosha, Wisconsin, but I decided that I would ask that question instead. how is white supremacy getting along? Because as we can see, and I don't know what all your thoughts were, there are lots and lots of things that have happened in the last 2 weeks that indicate how very healthy white supremacy is as a system of oppression. But as I said, instead of just launching into talking about the atrocities, the multiple atrocities that have occurred in Kenosha, Wisconsin, I thought I would ask that question so you could kind of reshape and frame your thinking in a different way. So imagine if the police had seen a white 3-year-old, a white 5-year-old, and a white 8-year-old in the back seat of Jason Blake's car. Imagine if Jason Blake had been white. One shot would have disabled him. In fact, the cop was grabbing his shirt, so he had him. He didn't have to shoot him at all. But one shot would have disabled him, but the cop felt the need to shoot him 7 times at point blank range. And point blank range in this case means either inches away from his body or with the muzzle of the gun right up against his body. I don't know if you have been following the reports about Jacob Blake's condition, but not only is he paralyzed, but most of his colon and lower intestines have been removed. So think about the kind of life he will live going forward, if he lives, because he's not out of the woods yet as far as is he going to survive, because what happens in these kinds of cases of severe internal trauma is that you can survive for quite a while, and then you get a major infection or something goes terribly, terribly wrong. So we can't assume that because we've heard reports that he's able to talk now and communicate with his family, that doesn't mean that he's out of the woods. But if he does survive, my understanding is that it would be a miracle if he could ever walk again, given that his spinal cord was severed, as well as vertebrae being damaged, but he also has had most of his colon and lower intestines removed. And then there is Kyle Rittenhouse from Illinois, and his biggest fan, Tucker Carlson. As we know, Kyle Rittenhouse is 17 years old, a minor, and he saw fit to go to Wisconsin, to Kenosha from Illinois, so he could protect whatever. I think he was focused on property, probably property and white people. That was what he was going to protect. And he is also a fan of the current inhabitant of the White House. He is on film seen in the front row of one of that one's rallies. And he took it upon himself with a long gun that he was visibly carrying. It's an open carry state, I take it. That he took it on himself to murder 2 people who he did not know and to wound another. I have not heard about the survivor's condition. After he did that, he walked by police. We can assume that police were near enough to perhaps have seen what he did. He walked by them and he went home to Illinois. And as Nicole Hannah-Jones, the wonderful writer and editor of the 16/9 Project from the New York Times, as she said, juxtaposing those 2 things, that is Jason Blake being shot 7 times at point blank range with his babies in the car watching, and then the 17-year-old white guy killing 2 people, and, just out there, not trying to hide it, just did it, wounding another, and he got to go home safely. Well, I've heard today on the news, and it's always bad news, of course, these days, isn't it? 45 will be going to Kenosha on Tuesday to meet with the police, because certainly they are the ones who have suffered most grievously during this tragedy. They've experienced the most tragedy and the most harm, the police. That's who the President of the United States will be meeting with on Tuesday. And then last night in Portland, you go to bed thinking it's one thing, you wake up and it's another. What happened last night in Portland, there's a member of a far-right group who was participating in an organized protest against the pro-Black Lives Matter movement protesters. This individual was killed. I don't know any more details than that. But if you don't think that we're in the middle of a race war, think again. Race war is another term that I use to talk about the state of race in the United States. The system of white supremacy describes it, and so does race war. I'm going to read to you now from the op-ed that I wrote back in May, started in May, and that was published in June in the Boston Globe about policing. And think about the fact that I wrote this after George Floyd was murdered, lynched, but before Rayshard Brooks was murdered, and certainly before Jason Blake was shot 7 times. So this is from The Problem is White Supremacy. In the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, there's much discussion about the urgent need to change the culture of policing. Certainly, this must occur, but it is naive to think that the culture of policing can be changed without addressing what created that culture to begin with. Our current version of policing is rooted in the slave patrols, whose job was to capture people who had escaped, to criminalize Black bodies, and to curtail Black freedom, using extreme violence to hold on to property, that is, other human beings, was universally accepted and legal. Police that act as an army of occupation in poor communities of color and as a front line of mass incarceration have direct links to the tradition of the paddy rollers of the antebellum era. That's what the patrollers were called by the enslaved Black people, paddy rollers, patrollers. To change the culture of policing, and this is what everybody's talking about now, the people who are on mainstream media, everybody's talking about the few bad apples and changing the culture of policing. And this is what I wrote back in May. To change the culture of policing, we need to look at where that culture came from. We will also need to recognize that contemporary policing and the entire criminal and justice system are themselves essential to maintaining white power and control. Changing the culture of policing would require getting rid of the soil in which it grows. Changing the culture of policing necessitates eradicating white supremacy. Now, very few people, I want you to notice from today on, I'm sure you partake of some media, I want you to notice how many people use the term white supremacy. It's not going to be many. Most people don't like to go there because if you talk about white supremacy, then you have to talk about something different than just people being nicer to each other and hugging, your children like after, it's like hugging your children after a mass murder shooting. When you see people being interviewed after those events, they will often say, well, I'm just going to go and hug my children, and I hope that everybody will go home and hug their children, as if hugging your children is not going to stop rampant gun violence and anything resembling sane gun laws. So whatever people are talking about in relationship to U.S. race war, not happening because they refuse to actually use those terms, those accurate terms. Think about the fact that I wrote that description of where police violence and police brutality comes from, that I wrote it before these egregious incidents that we are continuing to experience a lot of people have been harmed, hurt, and killed by the police, even in the last couple of weeks. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to read you some answers to questions that people asked last time. And I also will hope to say a few words about what does it mean to desegregate your life. So these are questions. These were questions if when you got the information about this session. These were the questions that I picked out that I thought, all the questions were good and interesting, but these were the ones I thought would be good to share answers with you during this session. So I'm just going to respond to these questions. And I hope, as I mentioned questions, I hope that you are formulating things that you would like to talk about when we get to our interactional part of our meeting today. The first question is, can well-intentioned white activists give up their white privilege? If so, how? This is complicated, since white privilege is something that you benefit from whether you actively cultivate it or not. For example, if you get pulled over by the police, if you are white, you are automatically less likely to be verbally abused, arrested for either a minor or non-offense, no offense at all, less likely to be beaten or murdered. Even being confrontational with the cops and being treated aggressively as a result is not the same as not having white skin privilege, and being confrontational with them is not going to erase your white skin privilege. I think that instead of focusing on giving up white privilege, you should instead be consistently conscious of how is my white privilege operating in this particular situation? And I'll repeat that, a question to ask. How is my white privilege operating in this particular situation right now? Especially when you are interacting with people of color. Treating people with sensitivity, but not condescension or infantilizing us. I hate that. Showing, and so does everybody else, showing respect for people of color, but also not enabling dysfunctional behavior. Another suggestion is to find out something about the lives of people of color instead of taking a supposedly colorblind approach. That's why one of my recommendations in the article in The Nation that came out a week ago Friday is to read. So let me just kind of repeat that for, for sake of it being more accessible. Treating people with sensitivity, but not condescension, are infantilizing us. Showing respect for people of color, but also not enabling dysfunctional behavior. I was talking to a friend a couple of weeks ago, and she was talking about something that a Black person was doing that was really not correct. And she said, but I can't say anything about it because they're Black. And I said, well, you know what? Idi Amin was Black. Mugabe in Zimbabwe was Black. Clarence Thomas is Black. You have nothing to say about that? That's what it means to take a liberal approach. The thought process of, oh, the Black person did something. In any other situation, I would say that that was not the right thing to do, but I'm not going to say anything. I have an actual terrible example of that that someone told me about. I was at a meeting once and someone arrived at the meeting and they talked about how there was a group of Black teenagers. I think they were, she might have said people of color, but I think they were Black teenagers. Doesn't make any difference. The operative thing is that they were people of color, teenagers, and they were throwing rocks at a white woman who could be seen to have mental health issues. So they were throwing rocks at another human being who was vulnerable and who had who needed could use help from the mental health, social work, psychological side of our service, structures, not from the police. But be that as it may, in Albany, the only way you can get someone that kind of assistance is to call the police. We used to have something, and it probably still exists, and I'm not going to be able to think of the terminology for it, but it's I think it's like a crisis intervention unit where people who were trained would come to those kinds of situations where someone needed those kinds of interventions. But this individual decided that she was not going to call the police because she was more concerned about what was going to happen, what could possibly or might happen to the teenagers than she was in helping the person who was actually being physically attacked. And I was just like, you got to be kidding me. I didn't tell her that. I didn't say that, but I just thought, I can't believe this. You have somebody who is actually being hurt in front of you. And because that person is white and the people who are doing the wrong thing are people of color, you're going to let them continue to do that because you think you're being anti-racist in the process. I was just like, oh, please. But see, that's an example of enabling dysfunctional behavior. You have to be solid enough in your core as a white person to understand when you need to intervene and step in. And you just have to be able to take whatever the repercussions of that are. You can stay and you can, mediate if the police came, You could do the best that you could to make that situation as less negative as possible. But to let that woman continue to be attacked, I just thought, no. And that's, that's what being a white liberal is in some ways. And that's what is being, kind of too woke for your own good is too. I hope that you've read my article in The Nation, because one of my favorite parts of that article is the list of things to do, which includes reading books. I'll be talking about that soon. How do we overcome this is another question. How do we overcome the desire for people and organizing spaces to locate white supremacy in individuals' minds, behaviors, or intentions in a way that ultimately undermines multiracial coalition building? I'm going to reread this question. How do we overcome the desire for people in organizing spaces to locate white supremacy in individuals' minds, behaviors, or intentions in a way that ultimately undermines multiracial coalition building? And my response to that was, I am not sure about this question. I'm not sure exactly what is being asked or said. I'm asking, is the questioner saying that people of color should not automatically jump to conclusions about where white people are coming from so that political organizing can go forward? Or is the question about people who only look at white supremacy as a set of individual attitudes instead of as systemic oppression? If the person who asked this question is on this Zoom call today, perhaps it can be clarified during the Q&A. I'm sorry I couldn't quite figure out how to understand that totally. Here's another question. What would you suggest white people do in order to tackle the issue of and help combat white supremacy? And again, I would refer you to the suggestions in my Nation article. The most effective thing to do to tackle and help combat white supremacy, however, is to organize, to do consciously anti-racist organizing. That's how everything gets resolved, through organizing. You can certainly be assured that the people who create all the chaos, like the people who are contributing most egregiously to climate change, they're organizing every day. They're doing it in a corporate and governmental corporate and governmental settings, but they're definitely organizing. They're sitting down in groups and they are figuring out what their priorities are. They're coming up with a set of actions to take, and then they get that done. So they're organizing. We need to organize as well. But the kind of organizing we're talking about is consciously anti-racist organizing. The next question is, are you hopeful that we will be able to confront and dismantle white supremacy in the United States? To be honest, the answer is no, not at this time. Sorry if I'm disappointing anyone. We cannot get rid of white supremacy as long as racial capitalism is in place. And that's just facts. We cannot get rid of white supremacy as long as racial capitalism is in place, because racial capitalism will not allow for white supremacy to fall, because racial capitalism cannot function without white supremacy. There you have it. And yes, I am a dyed-in-the-wool, unrepentant radical from the 1960s who never gave up on her politics. So yeah, you can, take it for what that's worth. But believe me, as long as we have a system of racial capitalism, white supremacy will be well taken care of and in place. Neoliberalism, which is what's being offered these days, we've had neoliberalism, we have all kinds of neoliberalism, but that's what's being offered as an antidote to comic book fascism, although it's not really comic book because people are dying. So neoliberalism is not going to get us out of this mess either. Having said that, however, we have to continue speaking out against white supremacy and organizing to destabilize and dismantle it. And I'm always hopeful politically. I've been hopeful politically since I was a teenager. That's a long time in a lifetime to be hopeful politically, because I've seen the changes that people have been able to make and do make. So just because, I'm not really optimistic about seeing white supremacy fall, at least certainly not in the short time I'm on Earth, we still have to struggle as if all is possible and be ready for opportunities. For example, if we didn't have a Black Lives Matter movement, what would this period since George Floyd was lynched, what would this period be like? What if we had no Black Lives Matter movement and we had not only George Floyd's lynching, but the ongoing egregious incidents of police violence and other kinds of vigilante violence? What would that look like? Because people did organize and because they maintained their organizing, even when it was not popular and even when it looked like we were not accomplishing very much at all, when the historical situation shifted, there was a Black Lives Matter movement that could respond. And we see some of that response. We have seen some of that response in the last few days with all the major sports teams going out on strike. It wasn't a boycott, it was a work stoppage to protest what had happened to Jacob Blake. So that, shows you how even in the face of, no, you may not solve it in your lifetime forever. It may last throughout your lifetime, or it might be 20 years from now or whatever, hence, however many years hence, you can still do something. I just wish that those sports teams had not gone back so quickly. But my understanding is that LeBron James, I was reading this on social media yesterday, that LeBron James consulted with former President Obama, and he told them that he thought they should go back. So there you have that. I'll leave that for you to mull over. But as I said, I think they should have stayed out a bit longer. I don't know what the WNBA is doing. If anybody has news about the WNBA, please, please share it when we get to that communication, direct communication later this afternoon. Here's another question. In a world so full of both beauty and horror, white supremacy and the climate crisis stand out to me personally as the horrors most direly needing energy. It can sometimes feel, though, like these issues are seen as unrelated or mutually exclusive. To care about one means abandoning the other. Do you see white supremacy and the climate crisis as connected? Any advice for those of us who feel deeply on both? And my response is, of course, white supremacy and the climate crisis are connected. Communities of color, particularly people in the global South, are fighting every day for environmental justice, and they know how connected white supremacy, colonialism, imperialism, and militarism are. So there's not any question about whether they're connected. The people who are paying the most severe prices for for environmental devastation and for the results of climate change, etc. Those are communities of color, which of course encompasses the global South. So yeah, they're absolutely connected. They're not. They're definitely not contradictory. And anything that you're involved in politically probably has a connection to white supremacy and racism, and any political work that you do should indeed have consciousness and be consciously anti-racist in order to address and challenge white supremacy. What is the next question? What is the most important anti-racism, anti-segregation work that we can do as a climate-focused organization? And here's where I talk about desegregating your life. Desegregate your life, and then you can desegregate your organizing. Whatever you do, do not be wishy-washy liberals about race. We need accomplices and co-conspirators. Obviously, there is an extreme crisis right now with domestic terrorism and extrajudicial murders at the hands of the police and white vigilantes. This is an obvious focus for work, but there are also other crises like poverty, the eviction crisis, failed and racist educational systems, etc., that also need your attention. The next question. As members of XR, how does the work of desegregating our individual lives help transform our organizing and organization? Desegregating your lives means that you will become meaningfully connected to real human beings who are people of color. You will find out about things and see things in quite different ways if you form more than superficial relationships with people of color, both individually and organizationally in groups. If you form these meaningful relationships, you might actually connect with people who are as concerned about the issues you are concerned about as you are. And even if they are not, you will bring that consciousness of what their lives are like and what their priorities are into your work within XR. I'm going to say more about desegregating your life after I get finished going through the questions. What have you seen get in the way? This is the next question. What have you seen get in the way or think could get in the way of our successfully partnering with other organizations and communities, including those of single or multiple oppressions? I'm going to reread that question. What have you seen get in the way or think could get in the way of our successfully partnering with other organizations and communities, including those of single or multiple oppressions. Something that can get in the way would be a realistic distrust of white people. Some people of color do not really wish to interact with white people unless they just must and have to. So that realistic distrust, and note that I said realistic, that can get in the way. A realistic dislike and antagonism toward white people. Infuriating white liberalism when white people have no idea how, as we say, have no idea to, as we say, come correct. Have you ever heard that? I don't know, because I can't see you, but we have a phrase, and the way we use it, we say, you need to come correct. And what that means, it's not just about racism by any means. It's a phrase or saying that is said within our group, which is like, don't be half-assed about stuff. Do not, be a day late and $1 short. That's another thing we say. Like, if you're going to do something, do it thoroughly, do it in a precise and conscious way, not in a hostile and ignorant way. You need to come correct. So, you go to see someone, in the hospital, although we don't have much visiting in hospitals, but here, this just is an example. When you go to see somebody in the hospital, you don't come and spread out, all your stuff, on their bed, for example. You don't ask them questions that might be hard for them to answer, because depending on how serious your illness is, you come correct. You act like you know where you are, and you conduct yourself as if you know where you are. And that can apply, though, to white people interacting with people of color. You need both humility and self-confidence to interact across differences. You need both humility and self-confidence to interact across differences. You also need a content-filled knowledge base of what you are dealing with, which I believe that you get from study, which means carefully reading critical, complex work and then discussing it with your comrades so that you understand it more deeply, so that all of you can grow. Study is not something that people who are politically involved pay much attention to these days, because everything is visible and available on a screen. You can Google a Wikipedia article and think that you know all that you need to know about it. Reading books is just, it's not cool. It's not popular. I know some of you read books. I wish and hope that all of you read books, and maybe I'd be pleasantly surprised to find out that anyone who's spent their time like this on a Sunday afternoon talking about a challenging subject are also book readers. I hope so. But when you begin to interact with, or try to want to interact successfully with people of color, you need to do so with some content behind it. And I don't mean the content you get from hip hop videos. There's nothing more debilitating than being treated as a stereotype based upon what people are able to gather from popular culture. And in the United States, Black people dominate popular culture. As my sister Beverly Smith said many years ago, if it was not for Black people being here, the only thing you'd be able to listen to on the radio would be the news. Now, she was in some ways exaggerating, but just think about it. You can go through any era of popular music, and I'm talking about popular music in the United States, as well as American classical music, which is jazz. America has its own classical music. It is jazz. It was, of course, created by Black people. But you can go through any era and you will see that what Black people are singing about, writing about, as far as like songs, the musical styles that we developed. I'm thinking about like the wonderful ensemble groups of the 1960s when I was growing up, like the Temptations and the Supremes. We took that to another level. It wasn't like there weren't white, quartets and trios and what have you, but we took it to a whole different level. I'm thinking about the Jackson Five, Michael Jackson and the Jackson Five. I mean, whatever era it is, disco, you name it, But please, now it's hip hop, right? Please do not address us as if we're all like a part of that hip hop thing. Do not. Actually talk to us appropriately, interact with us appropriately. Don't think that you know about us because you watch and really love certain groups that are popular now. I'm talking about musical hip hop groups, etc. Here's another question. Have you seen other movements successfully achieve proportionality and diversity in their leadership? And if so, what were the key factors in that success? And the answer is yes. The progressive and left wing of the second wave of the feminist movement did exactly what you asked, which is to work toward achieving proportionality and diversity in leadership. And you asked what were the key factors in that success? Well, it was having people involved in the feminist movement who had politics that were not merely liberal politics, because there was a bourgeois, and still is, there's a bourgeois women's movement, and they're not so great around issues of race and class and even sexuality and gender. They're not so great. They're kind of narrow. So we had those kinds of narrow feminist politics then, but then we had other kinds of feminist politics. We had socialist feminists, we had feminists of color, and we had lesbian feminists. And lesbian feminists were extremely important in this process of desegregating the women's movement. What we did, and I of course was centrally involved in these efforts, what we did was intentional, strategic, and intensive. We did not give up. We didn't think like, oh, we had one meeting, we had one event, where some people of color came and now we're done. We weren't playing. That was not what we were doing. And as I said, it was really with the leadership of lesbian feminists, both of color and white, that we got some stuff done in that regard. If you look historically at the women's movement from, say, the kind of Betty Friedan era to, say, the period of the 1980s and 1990s, you see an entirely different movement. You see entirely different issues being raised. And that's because people took that seriously. Desegregation became a priority. Here's, I think, the last question. You have accomplished much as an activist and have been doing activism work in many forms for a sustained period. Are there strategies, practices, perspectives, experiences, or other advice that you can share on how to keep going while avoiding burnout? And my answer to that, this is a question about burnout. I hear people talk about burnout often. I've had discussions with people about burnout, and this is my answer to that. As a socialist and a leftist, I am not personally familiar with political burnout. I am clear that this is a long struggle, way beyond my lifetime. If I am not comfortable and centered in a political context in which I'm working, I move on. So I don't think you should be miserable in the context of doing political work. I think that you have to assess constantly, is this work filling my soul? Is it good for my spirit? And if the question is, no, I'm miserable, I don't like these people, I don't want to be anywhere near these people, these people don't understand me, I don't like them, I don't think they like me, at least they don't treat me like they like me, then it's time to move on. It's absolutely time to move on. You are likely not going to be able to change toxic group dynamics our toxic political environments. There's plenty of work to be done. If you are drawn to, instead of working on the climate crisis, if you find yourself being drawn to dealing with the reality of such a disproportionately high level of maternal and infant mortality among Black and other women of color, if you feel yourself called to that, then maybe that would be a good thing and a fine thing to do. What you learned and what you accomplished and achieved in the context of doing organizing around a particular issue is never lost. One of the things that, you know, people say, there are all these things that older people say, and you come to find out that a lot of them are true. One thing that, of course, that is said is that nothing you learn is ever lost or irrelevant. Nothing that you learn is ever lost or irrelevant. It can be the most unexpected day or time that you know, crazy stuff that you learn, like in advanced algebra or in you know, U.S. you know, history or government, whatever you call it, that one of those things that you learn, you know, or something that you read, you know, and you're saying, oh my God, I actually know what the people are talking about today because I learned that already. I know about that. One of the things about organizing is I don't necessarily expect organizing to be my home. And I use that phrase, say that, because there's an article in one of my books, Homegirls, a Black Feminist Anthology, that really addresses the issue in some ways of burnout, because it's about how you need to be able to separate your personal needs, your human needs, from the political work that you're doing so that all the needs get met. And the name of the article is Coalition Politics, Turning the Century. It's by Bernice Johnson Reagan. She is the founder of the the incomparable a cappella singing group Sweet Honey in the Rock. So that's Bernice Johnson Reagan. And as I said, she wrote an article, Coalition Politics, Turning the Century, where she talks about the difference between where you do your organizing and home. So I just looked at my phone, just, I know what time it is. We're now going to watch a video, and then after that, we're going to take as many questions as we can.
So last but not least, before we have our Q&A, we have Charles Brown. Charles Brown is an activist, educator, and organizer based in the Hampton Roads region. He first became active in the environmental justice movement during his time as a student at Tennessee State University. After graduating, he moved to Virginia, where he has worked as an educator in Hampton, Virginia, and Newport News school systems. He has also worked in retail, which is how he became involved for the Fight for 15 movement. From political campaigns to work with environmental and Black-led organizations, Charles has spent close to 15 years of his life committed to eradicating injustice caused by generational and systemic inequalities. Community empowerment is always central to his mission. Please join me in welcoming Charles Brown.
Peace, everyone. Thank you for that introduction. I know we don't have a lot of time. I believe it's at 10, so I'm going to time myself. And there's a lot I want to talk about, but I do want to thank you all for putting me behind Stephanie, Ms. Rizzi, because a lot of what I'm going to say actually ties in with the housing justice movement. And I'm going to speak from my personal experiences on how I got into the environmental justice movement, because if we're being frank, there's still to this day not a lot of people of color in it, but there are a lot more Black people involved in the movement than there were 10, 15 years ago. So I want to tell you all about the story that got me involved, the case that got me involved, and this was when I was a student at Tennessee State University. I was a political science and geography major. And there was a case in a town called Dixon, Tennessee, the city of Dixon and the county of Dixon, Tennessee. And there was this family, the Hawk family, who had been living near a landfill for generations. But the way the city was situated, the way their houses were situated, they were like less than 60 feet away from this landfill that had been placed there around 1968. Now, this ties in with the whole housing and redlining piece, because if anyone understands the history of redlining in this country, of course, blacks couldn't live in certain areas, or we were relegated to certain areas, even in counties and in rural areas. But in rural areas, you were more likely to live closer to white folks. But if you've heard the expression across the train tracks, this area, you literally had the white side of town that was on one side of the train tracks and the black side of the town that was on the other side of the train tracks. So this landfill that the city had made, of course, to manage the area's waste, was put closer to the black family's home, but it was still contaminating, the whole area's drinking supply. So this starts in the 1960s. Mind, this family had been there for generations, but they find out in the 80s, the local government finds out in the 80s, early records indicate that they knew that this water was contaminating the drinking water. And they started warning the white residents not to drink with this water, not to cook or clean with this water, as much as you can, avoid it. Meanwhile, they let this black family, the Holtz, use this water for from 1968, which is when the landfill was made, up until around the year 2000. That's when they finally start realizing, hey, something is wrong. Their cancer rate in the family was skyrocketing. To this day, their family is still plagued by it. But I got involved in the case around 2007 when Sheila Holt, who's one of the matriarchs for the family, she started bringing the case to light because her father had passed away in early 2007. And at the time, I was a student working with an urban geography class. My minor was geography, so we were trying to work on urban studies. And I believe I had an urban studies class, and I had a urban planning class dealing with like city zoning and things of that nature. And if anybody understands how city zoning and city planning goes, of course, you got to have municipal buildings, you got to have residential zoning, all that boring stuff. And this ties in with redlining, because if you're going to have waste treatment facilities or anything that's dealing with waste, they have to put it somewhere. And more than likely or not, they don't want to put these facilities in areas that white people, more affluent people are at. Even if you look here in Virginia, you look at places like the coal plant, which is in downtown Newport News, and you look at its proximity to the East End area of Newport News, which is predominantly black. You see this pattern playing out across the country. So with this case in Dixon, Tennessee, it was very similar, but as I said before, it affected the whole community. It wasn't just affecting the black folks, but the difference was the government actually made sure, the local government actually made sure the white folks were taken care of, whereas they let the black folks use this water and pretty much be poisoned. So I'm thankful that I've been able to be involved and help bring awareness to it. But this is one of the cases that actually showed that, environmental justice and environmental racism isn't just about, caring about the polar bears. And I think a lot of times when people think about the environmental justice movement, or when they think about environmentalism, I should say, we think about the polar bears. And if I'm being honest, when I first came into the movement, the organization who was helping to fight this case, by the way, was a group called Gateway to Heritage, who was a campus-based and a community-based organization out there in Nashville, Tennessee. And when they first approached me about environmentalism, I was kind of one of those guys that was like, yeah, I don't really, care about what's happening in the Arctic like that. We have real issues happening down here on the ground. But realizing that what's happening with the environment, when they're poisoning the air, when they're poisoning the water, that's affecting Black and brown communities disproportionately. And it has been for years, but it's just not something that we think about, especially if you're going back to the civil rights movement, because of course we have more pressing issues to deal with at the time, but it's always been there. So they have gotten a settlement. I think as of 2012, they had finally got a settlement, the Hope family. But you still have this family that's devastated by years of consuming poison water. Numerous family members have died from cancer or still suffering from cancer and other ailments to this day. And we see that it comes down to the environment doesn't discriminate, but how humans choose to allocate our resources and alert people of the effects of or the negative effects of what's in the environment. That's where we do harm to one another. So that's really the awareness we want to bring around environmental justice and what environmental racism really comes down to. And even coming into more recent times, if we think about things here in Virginia, such as the ACP or the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, which has died a thankful death. If we look at the route, a lot of along the route, it was going through historic communities of color, like the Union Hill community in Buckingham County, Virginia, and then for the Southside Connector, it was going through the Georgetown community in the Chesapeake area of Virginia. And they specifically chose these lower economic and Black communities because they figured that they didn't have the wherewithal to really fight back. And around that same time, you also had other pipelines, matter of fact, still being built to this day, but a famous one, I'm not sure if you all know about, in Louisiana, called the Bayou Bridge Pipeline. And with my work with a group called Greenpeace USA, I had the pleasure of helping them out. But this is where I saw the intersectionality of criminal justice and environmental justice, where you had indigenous pipeline fighters as well as Black and brown pipeline fighters out there literally risking life and limb and being arrested. And meanwhile, you have these corporations literally poisoning the land, poisoning the water, being given slaps on the wrist, and yet you have people facing felonies. So thankfully, Virginia is not one of the states on this list, but Louisiana and Texas have in recent years passed laws that virtually make it a felony to protest what they call critical infrastructure projects. And this is a direct threat to freedom of speech and the right to protest, but it also makes it where if you try to fight for a cleaner environment, now you face a felony and all the things that come along with that. So in recent years, I think we're seeing that this isn't just about, I said before, the polar bears, and it's not just about not being able to breathe or things like that. It's actually literally about being poisoned and being forced to take it and not being able to do anything about it. So with my work in the movement, we've really been bringing awareness to it, bring the fight to the men as far as these local agencies, local governments, local corporations. Full disclosure, myself, for some of the work that I was involved with, one of a famous pipeline company actually chose me as a defendant in one of the suits that they was going at against their against my employer. But with that, it just shows that all this goes 360. So when we're thinking about environmental justice, it ties in with housing justice, and it also ties in with criminal justice, and it also ties in with the systemic injustices that we've been facing for years. But I think we're in a time now where we realize it, and I'm thankful that it's actually one of the topics that people are discussing as opposed to a back thought. And with that, I know I'm at my time or approaching it, so I'll conclude with that. Thank you all for having me.
So I wanted you to, I assume I'm still, I see myself, so I assume I'm visible and audible. Thank you for being able to incorporate that. I wanted you to see that because, of course, Charles Brown is somebody who's working on environmental issues, who's also a person of color, and he comes to those issues with that perspective. This is a part of a longer webinar online event which was titled Black Lives Matter, the Historic Development of Race and How It Affects Our Struggles Today. Bill Fletcher, a longtime political comrade and also a person who's been very active in the labor movement, was the primary presenter for that. And then there was a panel of 4 people. And when I saw Mr. Brown present, I thought, oh, that would probably work well with the next XR Understanding White Supremacy webinar that we're doing. So I now look forward to hearing your questions.
So just to run through it one time again, we've enabled the raise hand feature. So if you have a question, if you could please hit the raise hand, we'll get to as many as we can. All right, and Mark Schaefer, you're being switched over. If you could turn on your video and your mic, please.
Hi, this is Mark. Am I up?
You're up.
American capitalism is more unequal than capitalism in other parts of the world because it's racialized, because of the centrality of white supremacy in American culture. As Barbara indicated, that there's this mutual reinforcement between racial capitalism and white supremacy. One of the effects of white supremacy is to divide the working class racially. So my question is, what is the strategic approach to breaking that hegemonic relationship?
Well, that's a huge question. That's more than the $64,000 question. And thank you, Mark. It's nice. Your little icon is on, so I'm not really seeing you, but since I know you, I recognize your voice. In any event, as I said, that's a really huge question. That's how white supremacy works. White supremacy has always divided the working class in this nation for its own ends. And unlike, there are other countries where there's similar kinds of dynamics, where there's a strong class structure, if you are not of the right class or the upper classes, say in a place like the United Kingdom, then there's that division as well. But the working class is not necessarily being divided from other parts of it because of race. At least that did not happen in the United Kingdom until after World War II, when people from the from former colonies came to the motherland, and then suddenly the United Kingdom was a multiracial society in a way that it had never been previously. But the history of the United States, as you know, is one of chattel enslavement. First, genocide of the indigenous people and land theft, and then chattel enslavement. And the system, racial capitalism, has always been able to use those racial divisions to get exactly what it needed to out of the system for maximum profit and maximum exploitation. This is very, very, very difficult because the long time attitudes that most white people have about people of color are so embedded and so incredibly negative that that's one of the things, like my article in The Nation, when I write about like a Marshall Plan to eradicate white supremacy, there are things that I did not put into that article because I knew the publication for which I was writing it. And I also, I never have a need to be rhetorical. And what I write, I want to inspire people, and I want people to get information that might be of value to them. And I want to push the conversation forward. So saying in that article, and by the way, this is not going to happen until racial capitalism ends, like I would have lost, I think, some people who would be interested in what I was trying to conceptualize. But that's why we go back to movements and organizing. We have a very weak left in this nation. We have a weak left. We have a weak labor and labor union movement. It would help to build a much more robust labor movement in this country, I think, in order to be a counterweight and strong opposition to racial capitalism. But it's very, very difficult because the ideology of white supremacy, which says that people like me and that people of color are wholly different kinds of human beings who inherently deserve less and who inherently deserve ill treatment. That's a hard one to get rid of. I mean, this idea that Kyle, Rittenhouse felt like he needed to cross state lines to protect something. The fact that the president is going to meet with the police because and that all last week at the national meeting of the White Citizens Council, also known as the Republican National Convention, they don't care. They don't feel anything. We may feel a lot. We may feel devastated about Jacob Blake and Breonna Taylor and Sandra Bland and Ahmaud Arbery and Tamir Rice and George Floyd. The list goes on and on. We may feel distraught about those incidents. And as I said in my article, the Nation article, I said, there are people who look at the murder of George Floyd and they wonder what he did to deserve being choked to death. They will look at the same video we look at with horror and they want to know, what did he do wrong? What did he do wrong? He must have done something wrong. They're doing that with Jacob Blake as well. So the ideology of white supremacy, the powerful reality of white supremacy as a system, is just very, very, very challenging to alter that. But that's why we keep on struggling. That's why we're in struggle. Thanks for the question.
All right, next up should be Leo Levy. If you could turn on your mic and your video. Looks like you're still muted there.
Yeah, and I guess people are not wanting to be seen either.
Okay, I have unmuted, Barbara. Can you
How do
hear
you
me?
feel about your video?
You got me technologically challenged, but let's see if we can.
Okay, you don't have to. Yeah. Since these questions, these first two questions are from people I actually know, so.
All right. I'm sorry about the video. If Martha sneaks up on me and hits the right button, you'll be able to see.
Okay, it's okay.
But
go on.
I had sent in to you and Chris a question based on my reading of your August 21st article in The Nation. I don't know if you saw the question or not, but you had introduced the Hamer-Baker plan, and I was not sure. You likened it to the Marshall Plan, and I wasn't sure if you really were thinking of some kind of centralized plan as opposed to something that could be implemented on a regional or a local basis. I wondered if you wanted to talk about that distinction at all.
Okay, thank you, Leo. Ideally, it would be a centralized national plan, because how else, you can't get rid of white supremacy in one place, one city, one state, and then have it everywhere else. I mean, that's not, oh, hi, how are you? Thank you, Martha. That's not, that is not the way that you address a massive, pervasive, universal social problem. But given how unlikely it is that the powers that be will ever say, oh yeah, let's get rid of white supremacy right quick. Yeah, let's do that tomorrow. Given that that's not the case, I actually did a presentation with an editor at the Boston Globe about my first article, where I first brought up this concept of a Marshall Plan to get rid of white supremacy. And I actually proposed that if we can't do it on a national level, maybe we should do it locally, like in this whole state of Massachusetts. I said that I didn't think that New York State would work out because New York State's too crazy, you know, by which I mean, oh, I won't even go into it. We can talk about that later. But yeah, I just thought, well, you know, I've lived in Massachusetts too. And I thought, yeah, Massachusetts, reasonable sized state. I think it's the bluest state in the entire nation. So we're better to try to implement such a plan than in Massachusetts. And also, it has the distinction of having one of the most racist cities in the entire nation, which is Boston. So it's perfect. You know, blue state, manageable size. You can drive from one side to the other in like 2 hours or so. And then you have this enclave of racism, which is Boston. So let's get to work. But I suggested that people look at, that's one of my lists of suggestions. I suggested that people look at their localities and think about how they might apply the concepts that I tried to put forth in the in the Hamer-Baker plan, and try to apply it to where we are. We could certainly try that here in the city of Albany too.
Thank you.
And thank you.
All right, next up is Benjamin Wong. If you could turn on your mic and video.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hi, Ben.
Hi, Barbara, how are you?
Fine, thanks. And yourself?
Good, good. So firstly, thank you very much for taking the time to do this talk. Sorry about my camera, I left it at work, so I don't have it with me.
Okay.
Only on audio.
Okay.
So my question, actually I have two very short questions. And I wanted your take on them, actually. So first one is that I think words matter, right? What we say matters. And I don't really like the expression white supremacy. And the reason is because I feel that it's too soft. It's not a strong enough or powerful enough word. And I prefer something along the lines of fascism or neo-fascism, right? Which I essentially think, you know, that's what we're seeing right now, right? And, you know, the original fascists were KKK, the K Klansmen, right? So I wanted your take on you know, wording like neo-fascism or fascism to describe what we're seeing today. And then the second question was, I guess like the very small silver lining I can see in what is happening today is that the United States is being confronted with a reality that we cannot deny, we can't avoid. You know, when I was growing up, we always felt like, yes, racism exists, but it's not a big part of our culture. It's not important. It's being managed or under control, and you know, it's just a fringe element. But now, what is happening around the country? It's very, very obvious that it is not a fringe element. It is actually a core component of our society, and it's almost like a mirror being held up to us, showing like this is what America is, and we can no longer deny or hide from it. So that's the thin silver lining that I can kind of see in this period now. So I just wanted your take on those.
Thank you, Ben. For the first one, white supremacy is hardly a nice or weak word or phrase. As I have said frequently during these two webinars, that most people refuse to use the term white supremacy that's how repulsed they are by it being brought up. So as I said, far from it being a weak description of what's going on, it's the strongest description, except perhaps for white nationalism. And even white nationalism has a different connotation in some ways than white supremacy. But they are absolutely, they are connected to each other, white nationalism and white supremacy. But for people who have been the targets of white supremacy from, for centuries, from time out of mind, and for people who also study the history and the sociology, the social, economic, political, historical reality of white supremacy, it absolutely is accurately descriptive of what we are dealing with here. Fascism, on the other hand, could be anything else. Fascism, as it manifested itself before World War II and during World War II in Europe, absolutely had a strong racist agenda, which was the genocide of at least 6 million people of Jewish heritage and others as well who died in the Holocaust. So it's not that there's no connection between fascism, and I can't remember the other term that you used. What other term did you use that you thought might be preferable?
Neo-fascism.
Yeah, neo-fascism. It's not that they don't have a connection to racialized, racist agendas. They absolutely do. But if you want to talk about what's going on in the United States over centuries of time, you talk about white supremacy, because that's the description. Most people prefer racism. They like prejudice. They like race relations. They like systemic racism. They like bigotry. They like anything except for white supremacy. So I think that as long as we have white supremacist ideology, power structures, organizations, that we don't see that quite the same way. And you'll have to remind me of your other question now.
The second question was about the silver lining of now that we see what's going on. It's now being held up as a mirror to our society. We can no longer avoid it or deny it or sweep it under the rug, right?
Yeah. I think that's true for some people, but I think for those who are most committed to white supremacy, who are most involved in white supremacy, who are most in love with white supremacy, who think they benefit most signally and highly from white supremacy, they're not really convinced. I've been hearing disturbing reports about statistics out of Wisconsin that at the beginning of the summer, after George Floyd was lynched, that people in Wisconsin, about 68% or so of them were supportive of the Black Lives Matter movement. Now it's down into the 40s following some of the events that have happened in the interim. So I don't know if it's a silver lining. I'll say this is an unprecedented time of focus on racial reality in the United States, unlike any period since the 1960s. The fact that there have been demonstrations going on for, I think, 90 plus days now in places all over the nation. They're not at the same level as they were within the days and weeks right after George Floyd was killed, but the fervor is still there, and people still seem to be admitting that there is a racial crisis. The question is, what do we do with that reality? What do we do with that fact? There's only a silver lining if we can organize to another level and a better place. So it's a silver lining if we can use the current situation, the current reality, current events actually, if we can use those to push forward and to build stronger our movements that oppose the oppression. So we'll see. It's up to us, isn't it?
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, next up is Maya. Maya, if you could turn on your mic and your video, please.
Great. Hi there. Thank you so much.
Hello.
This was so so beautifully done, and I just love your vision of the Hamer Baker plan. And I think about when you talk about Massachusetts being at this, you know, sort of a pilot state, I think about Marge Piercy's book, Woman on the Edge of Time, where Mata Poisette is a place where we sort of play out some of these very leftist visions. So that was beautiful. I had a question about, I saw that poll that you mentioned about white support for Black Lives Matter coming down. And I'm wondering about, I have two questions. I'm wondering about, I worry that the terminology defunding the police, like those of us on the left who recognize that how expansive what that means. It's such a, you know, it's huge. But I see the rhetoric on the right playing on the fears of white people, that white supremacy is being dismantled, like this fear of chaos. That's what the, you know, the Trump, you know, spokespeople are saying. And I'm wondering how we can talk in a more sane way so that people hear better what needs to happen with the police. And then another question about locally, I work at RISE with refugees, and we just learned on Friday that 7th through 12th graders in the Albany Central School District are going to be all online. And I'm so worried. Many of our refugees are from Congo. They're struggling to learn English, and now they're going to be cut off even more. And it's all because of funding. And I watch my own children in suburban schools still having in-class learning. You know, clearly we need to move away from the tax structure where schools are funded by, you know, the local communities. What can we do right now? Because I am so worried about these children in Albany School District having all virtual for yet another year.
Yeah, I've been worried about them since the very beginning of the pandemic. I spent a lot of my time in the last more than a decade trying to get the Albany School District to be a functioning, you know, quality school district for all of its students. And that was all volunteer work. I was never, you know, paid by the district. I put in many, 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 many years into that work. So I'm not unfamiliar with the issues specifically in our school district. I guess I'm answering your second question first. I don't know what can be done. My understanding is that school funding has been cut severely for all the districts, and because of the fact, and this goes right to the system of white supremacy. Why in the world is school funding based upon your real estate tax base? Because by doing it that way, you absolutely ensure superior education for people who have more economic privilege and inferior education for those who do not. End of discussion. Very, very simple. It's insidious. And to use a word I used last time, diabolic. It's diabolic.
Yeah.
All we can do is, you know, what we always do, organize and speak out for justice. There are people who I know who go to school board meetings. Every time there's a school board meeting, they are there. They are monitoring what is going on. And this is as residents of the city of Albany. This is not because they have any particular, you know, investment, you know, in any other way. They don't have children in the district, but they are so committed to quality education for all students that they have taken it upon themselves to be at all of those meetings. That's something that anyone could do, because you know how they say sunlight is the best disinfectant? Disinfectant. Eyes on a problem. That's what that expression means. You know, what you can get away with when no one's looking. The sunlight of people paying attention can be helpful. The other question that you asked was about defunding the police, and if you could allow, I'm not talking about you, if people could allow the sentences to be finished as opposed to closing off when they hear the first few words. Defunding the police so that those resources can be applied to and used for the needs in communities that are economically exploited and without resources. You said you live in the suburbs. The suburbs are not heavily policed. But what do the suburbs have? They have parks, they have businesses, they have quality schools, they have quality, decent housing. They have all the things that people basically need to have a decent life. And then what do the parts of our community that are heavily policed, what do they not have? All those things that the people in the suburbs take for granted. And of course, some would say, well, the reason that is because the people in the suburbs, they did what they were supposed to do. They're not welfare cheats, they're smarter. They stayed in school, they didn't drop out, they went to college, they got good jobs, blah, 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 blah. In other words, acting as if systemic poverty is not systemic. The scripts get written early on, and the scripts are written not just for people of color, they're written for other people too, for white people as well. But that generational poverty, that's built in. And that's built into capitalism / racial capitalism. So it's not so easy to escape from poverty and to have the things that people in the suburbs take for granted. So the end of the sentence, as I said, if people would just listen, it's defund the police so that the resources can be applied where they need to be applied. And that would include mental health, social work, healthcare as well. And I'm seeing Chris, so I think we're at our time.
All right, thanks so much for the question. And thanks everybody for coming today. It's been another wonderful presentation. Thank you, Barbara, for your amazing lifelong work and sharing your experiences with us. I'm gonna once again share in the chat the link to the Barbara Smith Caring Circle. Barbara has not charged anything for this, but I can tell you it puts a lot of work into them and a lot of thought into all of this. So if you haven't yet, go ahead and click on that link and donate there. Next up in the chat, I'm also going to put a link to a Zoom room that's going to be open after this, where people can come and chat about what we just heard, maybe meet some people who have similar interests in these issues. So please feel free to cut and paste that into your browser and join us for a little discussion after this. And also, please keep your eyes out for the next announcement. This is not the last. This is the second of 3. So the next one you're really going to want to catch. And I'm not sure what the time scale is yet, but keep an eye on your email inbox. So thanks very much. And Barbara, thank you very much.
I just want to say thank you to Chris and to everyone.
Thanks, Barbara. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you.